Hey gang, welcome back to another video and part 2 of the Mystery Haunted Mansion project. I'll be picking up from where I left off last week, so let's all drag our bodies to the dead center of the room and get right to it. Before I start any project, I like to take a deep dive by way of a Google image search. I'm looking for anything and everything that could potentially be helpful. Photos, dimensions, and if I'm extremely lucky, blueprints. And I throw everything I find into a folder so that I can refer to it once I get into the design part of the build. For this piece, I had some rough ideas as to the dimensions, and was able to pull together a simple frame that would surround the transom metalwork that I made in a previous video. Once the model was complete, I could slice it into multiple pieces that would fit on my 3D printer, and then it was time to print. And that about brings us to now. As you can see, the frame is in multiple pieces and needs to be assembled. But I thought this would be an interesting time to test out a few different methods for joining 3D printed parts. So I started with the 2 bottom frame pieces and gave the ends a good sanding to help give them the best possible gluing surfaces. And once I felt like both halves were flat, I grabbed a piece of gaffer's tape, which I'll use as a third hand during the gluing process. This is a trick I've seen a lot of woodworkers use when doing glue-ups, and I found that it works pretty well for bonding 3D printed parts too. The only thing left to do was apply the first glue, Weld On 16. I've mentioned this glue in a previous video, but essentially it's a solvent bond, so when it sets up, it really sets up. The only hang-up is that its bonding power is slightly impacted by exposure to oxygen, so it's important to really get those pieces together once you've applied the adhesive. Clamps are particularly helpful in this step too. Once the piece had time to fully cure, I wanted to test out this new method of joining parts that I saw Uncle Jesse use in a few videos over on his YouTube channel. I'll leave a link in the description if you want to check out his video as well. This tool basically heats up these tiny metal staples, and the filament melts around it, trapping it in place. Then you can remove the tool, and the leftover tines can get clipped away with a wire cutter. It's an interesting concept, although I don't know if it really works as well as I'd like. To keep down the weight, this print only has 10% infill, so the staples don't have a ton of plastic to bite into, which means the placement becomes really important. And on a print like this, it doesn't leave a lot of room for error. So this may not be my first line of defense, but it might make for a good failsafe. With the first section done, it was time to repeat the process on the peak section, sanding the joining edges flat and then gluing them together. However, this time I'm going to use this Total Boat 4-minute epoxy instead of the solvent glue. While I like the solvent glue, I think for a project like this, where you need a little bit of working time before your glue sets, using something like a 2-part fast-setting epoxy seems like a better approach. That way I can nudge things around until everything is lined up, and then throw a few spring clamps on there to hold it all in place. I set aside the peak section, and while I wait for it to set up, I noticed there was a small gap on the bottom section that I needed to fill. So I grabbed a bit of baby powder and some CA glue to make a paste, and then smeared it into the joint until it was just slightly proud of the surface. That way I could sand it flush once it cured. This is a fast and easy way to hide some smaller seams without needing any special products or tools. The only thing left to do now was glue up the remaining pieces, so I mixed up a bit more epoxy and got down to it. It was at this point that I realized I'd made a mistake. See this joint here? It doesn't match. When I prepped my 3D models for print, I mirrored every part of this frame except for the left vertical piece, and because of that, this piece didn't fit. So I had a decision to make. Either try to fill the gap with body filler and then try to mimic the profile as best I could, or 3D print the correct part. And for me, there was only one choice.